Mhm. So is everyone seeing my screen, my PowerPoint? Yes? Okay, good. So, all right. So, welcome everyone to Environmental Fridays. It is personal. This is season 7 of Environmental Fridays. And you could connect with us online at our website, www.theenvironmentalfridays.com. Or you could also use the QR code down here in the right-hand corner to get to our website. This season 7, we have scheduled 15 episodes, 16 guest speakers. Today, as you could see here, we will have our speaker comes from Minnesota, but we have guest speakers from a number of different places, as you could see. For November, and we are like in the middle of November already, time just goes by so quickly, it's insane. So today we will, of course, be hearing from Professor Craig Packer, and you will hear my co-host, Marlene Murray. And for full transparency, we are first cousins, Marlene and I. And he will be talking about environmental impacts um, on the African lion. Next week, we'll hear about oil spill that occurred last year, I believe, in Tobago. And so we'll get an update on that. And our last guest speaker for this month is a colleague of mine here in architecture, Mark Moreno. So that's what's coming up for this month. One of the reasons for not just this Environmental Fridays program, but more importantly for Earth Day. Earth Day was really started, the environmental movement really got started as a consequence of this photo that you're looking at right now. It is referred to as one of the most iconic photos in human history. This is what was taken by astronaut Bill Anders for Apollo. He was on the Apollo 8 mission. And if you want to find out some more about that, you could simply Google or go to YouTube and do Earthrise. The QR code in the corner here to the right takes you to an interview of Bill Anders. So this is an important picture. This is a picture of our home from out of space, actually from the surface of the moon. So that's a really important aspect and motivation. The United Nations Environmental Program has listed these 3 problems, threats, as global threats: pollution, climate change, loss of biodiversity. And I believe, what we'll hear today, while it may focus on loss of biodiversity, these 3 are interconnected, no doubt about it. Pollution affects the climate change affects the loss of biodiversity and so on. I'll skip this and go introduce my my cousin, Marlene. So she's been a professor of biology here since 2001. She did her postdoctoral training in multi-drug resistance in leukemia at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She currently teaches genetics, human biology, and molecular genetics. We've done several collaborative projects together, particularly dealing with probing into anti-bipolar drugs. So it's a pleasure here. Actually, we went to school together. I think we overlapped at Wayne State University in Detroit, where we both did our doctoral work. So at this point, I will have Marlene introduce our speaker for today.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Desmond,
You're
for
welcome.
giving me this opportunity to introduce our distinguished university professor, Dr. Craig Packer. He's coming from the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior from the University of Minnesota. He is the director of the Lion Research Center. He is a fellow both of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Association for Advancement of Science. Dr. Packer has published over 200 scientific papers and 3 books. The 3 books are Into Africa, which won the John Burroughs Medal. The second is Lions in the Balance. And the third is the lion, behavior, ecology, and conservation of an iconic species. As a student, he studied baboons with Jane Goodall. Let that sink in.
Yes, I know, right? Yeah.
With Jane Goodall at the Gombe Stream Research Center in Tanzania. Okay. He was named the Wildlife Conservationist of the Year by the Cincinnati Zoo and received the Dawkins Award in Conservation from Balliol College. He currently serves as scientific director of the Mara Predator Conservation Program in Kenya. So without further ado, let us hear from Dr. Packer about the impact of the environmental impact on the African lion.
Thank you. So Dr. Packer, you could go ahead and share again, upload your screen. There you go. Looks good. Full screen. Good. All right.
Thank you, Desmond and Marlene, both. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. My title I have on here is somewhat different from what I have on the list, but I think it's because these environmental impacts, they come from very many different sources, and they all affect the conservation of this species, which I will show you is a very problematic species to try to conserve because they are very, very dangerous animals. And that's something that is often foremost in my mind when I think about them, is the harm they can cause on local populations. So I want to just remind you, I'm sure you're all familiar with, I just want to make this sort of the foundation of what I want to be saying later.
Yeah, dude. Okay. Okay, some people still don't have Zoom etiquette.
So,
yeah, dude. Go ahead, I'll take care of this.
okay. So the lion, what we call today the African lion, is a species that used to range over a very large part of the old world, from the Cape of Good Hope down in southern Africa, all the way across the north of the continent and through the Middle East to India. Alexander the Great famously killed a lion back in the day. But today, there are just scattered populations left. There's one small population still in India, and the rest, and the ones I'm most concerned about, are those in sub-Saharan Africa. Small numbers of lions in West Africa going across the center to East Africa, then down. Now, this area, as you're also no doubt probably familiar with, is where most of the poorest countries can be found today. So economic development has not yet reached many sub-Saharan African countries. And so people live in pretty abject poverty in many of these areas, especially in rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa. And with the poverty and the lack of opportunity, the lack of women's education, etc., we still see a very rapid population growth. So world population growth going forward for the next few decades is expected to be concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. So keep this in mind, just because some of the pressures I'm going to be talking about arise from that poverty and the growing human pressures on remaining populations of the lions. So I'm going to go through a series of challenges that I've addressed in my research, uh, having worked in the Serengeti National Park in Tanzania for many decades. And one of the things that was really altered my own career was the fact that a population that we'd been studying in the middle of an extremely well protected national park showed this sudden drop. That's that red vertical bar here in 1994. Mm-hmm. And we'd never seen anything like this. The population had actually been studied since 1966, and you get minor changes in the number of lions in this large area that we were monitoring. And then suddenly there's this large drop. So what was going on? We soon realized that the lions were dying from an infectious disease that caused them to go into convulsions and also could cause other neurological damage. This male lion is showing a typical twitch on the left side of his face. He involuntarily, there's a spasm on his lip on the left side where the arrow is pointing. And we saw the deaths, we saw these damages originally in our own study area. This is the middle of the Serengeti where we studied the lions. It's about 2,000 square kilometers. It started at the very end of 1993 and then spread throughout our study population in early 1994. And we had examples of this way down here in the southwest of the ecosystem, out in the far west, and then even up into Kenya in the Masai Mara Reserve throughout that year. And notice that there are other species that are infected with this as well. And so we developed a hypothesis that there's a disease that actually had originated in these domestic dogs, where there was also evidence of a similar disease as far back as 1992. And so the culprit for bringing the disease into the middle of the park was actually this animal, the spotted hyena. These are animals that can commute very long distances. And so right up here, there are villages outside the park, and the hyenas were known to go up into these areas in the dry season and then come back down into the study area during the wet season. And in these areas, in these very poor villages on the outside of the reserve, people keep dogs. And when the dogs get sick and die, there's really no disposal system. So that the carcasses of the dead dogs are often just left out for the hyenas to come and to eat. And so is we have a very large population of domestic dogs. So these densities are really high. I mean, 50 dogs per square kilometer, whereas you might get one lion every 10 square kilometers inside the park, or maybe two hyenas every 10 square kilometers. You've got far more domestic dogs than you do wild carnivores. And the problem here is because of the lack of wealth in these countries, particularly in Tanzania, there's no veterinary services for companion animals. There are veterinary offices in Tanzania, but it's mostly for people's livestock. And I'll talk about livestock later on. But right now, we're focusing on their domestic dogs. And without vaccinations, then we know there are all kinds of diseases that can spread very rapidly from one dog to the next and also back and forth into the wildlife. And so we started a very large scale vaccination program in the domestic dogs. And so we would have a vaccination day in each village. People would bring their dogs in to be vaccinated. And we vaccinated them against canine distemper virus because that was the bug that we were pretty sure was causing the problem in the lions, and rabies. And because there hadn't been vaccinations against rabies, about 200 people per year were actually dying from rabies in these rural areas around the Serengeti National Park. This is a disease that almost no one dies of in the West, but we have vaccinations for all of our pets. So rabies is a human health issue. Canine distemper was, in fact, and we did diagnose it, was a disease that was causing the neurological problems in the lions. And why was it that the vaccines that we set up, we found that even though we vaccinated tens of thousands of dogs every year around the Serengeti, we were not terribly successful at controlling the distemper thereafter. And this is because if we look at the genetics, sort of a phylogenetic tree of individual uh, samples of canine distemper virus that we've taken from domestic dogs, that it seems like there was this one transmission into the hyenas, those are the red ones here, and then from that, they were giving it to the lions, and that happened all over the place. So this is a very infectious disease amongst the wildlife themselves. Rabies, we were able to control, and we brought the death rate down in the human population around the park, and we also did a good job of removing rabies from the wildlife themselves, so there was no more cases after a few years of our vaccination program. And the reason we think this one was successful, whereas this one was not, is that these show transmissions that are all between dogs. So one dog to the next, one dog to the next, and then it might get into a cow, but then the cows are not infecting anybody else. The goats aren't infecting anybody else. And when it got into hyenas, again, they would die from it, but they couldn't transmit it to another wild animal. Likewise with a genet, and here with an aardwolf, which is a kind of a hyena-like animal that eats termites. And so these are dead ends. And so the virus here is mostly circulating in the dogs. Once it gets into wildlife, it peters out. But with a distemper, when it gets into the wildlife, it keeps spreading and perpetuating itself amongst the wildlife themselves. So when we looked at the infectious diseases and we started our big dog vaccination program, we realized that the canine distemper, by vaccinating the dogs, that's not enough because the dogs are not the sole reservoir host for that highly infectious virus. But with rabies, yes, they are the definitive host, but it meant we had to keep going. And so we started that dog vaccination program in 2003, and it has continued on to today. And before we did this study, the World Health Organization and uh, other organizations felt that rabies control in rural Africa was not feasible. But our study actually proved that yes, you can control rabies. You just have to invest the resources, making the vaccine available to the local vets who are mostly livestock agents, but they can deliver the vaccine to the domestic dogs and protect many human lives across the continent. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about infectious diseases. Now I want to look at another thing that we know had an impact on lion numbers, and this is the result of trophy hunting or sport hunting. Now, in North America, people mostly get a license or a permit to go out and shoot a deer or an elk, or they go and they shoot ducks. But in Africa, people come over to shoot these very dramatic large animals. And so, one of the things that the hunting community did not appreciate is that the lion, you can't harvest lions, and they only shoot adult male lions, that doesn't have the same effect for as you would get from only shooting stags of elk or deer or something, because in those species, if you shoot the male, there's plenty of other males around to mate with the females, and there's no consequence on the offspring of the male that you've shot. And so this was pretending in this chart as if lions had a social system that was more like deer or stag, and you could have hunters coming in, and you can have a population that's close to 100 animals. And this is the computer simulation. So we modeled this based on our demographic data that we knew how old a lion was before they started breeding. We knew how often they would successfully have cubs, how many cubs they'd have at a time, how long everybody lived, et cetera, et cetera. And so we could mimic in our computer kind of a silicon or simulated lion population. And so we have this thing running, and it can stably have about nearly 100 lions in this simulated population, 100 adult females. And if you then, in your computer simulation, harvest different numbers of males, so, it's like a video game taking out so many males per year, that as long as you're shooting males above a certain age, it has almost no impact on the population. You can have an impact if you shoot out every single young male, because then there's no males for the females to mate, right? The population has run out of sperm. And so the fertility would finally fall if you took out way too many males and you got rid of all the older ones, okay? But now the lion doesn't have that kind of social system. Lions live in very discrete, well-defined social groups. We call them prides, and it's multiple females in the pride, and that persists for generations. So you have grandmothers, mothers, daughters, sisters, cousins, etc. And then you have a coalition of males that come into the pride from somewhere else. And if the new males come in, they come in as a coalition from anywhere from 2 to even up to 9 males at once. And they're in a hurry to start breeding. And so otherwise, if they are patient, then the females, if they had small cubs when the new males arrive, the females would not be available for mating for almost 2 years, because that's how long it takes for them to rear their cubs. So instead, when the males come in, they kill all the small cubs. So they're infanticidal. And so by doing this, this gets the females to return to reproductive condition within a few days. And so then they can start their own family by replacing their stepchildren with their biological children. Now, obviously, when you have a species that does that, then you're going to have a considerably higher cub mortality. So the population, even without any hunting, is already going to be a little bit lower. But now it's a species that's really sensitive to what happens when you shoot males. If you're shooting somebody's father, that's going to make his family more vulnerable to a takeover by an incoming set of males. And so not only are you shooting the male, but you're inadvertently killing his cubs. So here you can see the effect of age is even more dramatic. And so even males that are 3 years of age and 4 years, sorry, I mean 4 years of age, or even 5 years of age, you can start pulling the population down. So you still have the problem, you run out of sperm if you shoot out every single male, but it's even worse now. It's even more sensitive because of the infanticide. Okay. So the reason we thought about doing this by age was because when we looked to see what these trophy hunters were actually shooting, it was shocking to discover that they were very proudly advertising, you can come to Tanzania and you can shoot lions, and here's your amazing trophy. And these are barely cubs. I mean, they're just, this one is less than 2 years old. And this one's only about 2 years. It hasn't even started growing a mane yet. Neither is this one. And so what that tells us is that in those hunting blocks where you have these guys coming over from the US and from Europe, none of the big impressive males are left. And so they're having to shoot these youngsters just to fill their quotas. So here we have the worry that they could really seriously be over harvesting, that they will have taken out all of these, taken out all the 5 years old, and now they're shooting even less than 4 years old. They could be driving the population right down. by taking these really, really young animals. So I was able to get data from the relevant authority in Tanzania, and I could look to see what was going on in each hunting block over the years. And sure enough, if they were shooting too many lions, and this is now 10 lions per 1,000 square kilometers, they're shooting that many males, that in these blocks, as a result of shooting so many males initially, their harvest just dropped in subsequent years. And so they were driving the population down by their overhunting. On the other hand, if they were only taking a few, maybe less than one male per 1,000 square kilometers, then the population could cope with that and it didn't decline. And their harvest would be steady from one year to the next. So we could tell them that, hey, if you're shooting more than one male per 1,000 square kilometers, you're driving the population down. You're having an adverse effect on it. So, in this case, with the sport hunting, this actually was taken up by a lot of the wildlife authorities across Africa. And now people insist that you can only shoot male lions if they're at least 6 years of age. If you shoot those younger ones, you have a risk of overharvesting. So now in Botswana, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, there is that minimum to prevent overhunting, too frequent infanticide. So we felt reasonably okay about our contributions on that one. The next one I want to get to is really the toughest one, and this is really, I think, most relevant to people who are interested in the realities of what's happening in the future for species like the lion, and that is human-lion coexistence. And so I want to give you a little bit of background here. So for many years, my research was focused on the lions well inside the middle of the Serengeti National Park, very well protected, even though, there were these diseases that occasionally came in and could kill the lions. But otherwise, these animals are living, as they would have done for thousands of years in the past. And I was concerned that over the years, that there had been a lot of efforts by aid organizations. There's USAID in the US, there's the World Bank, there's the European Union has aid programs that are trying to help with the economic development of rural Africa. And so we started a program that we called the Whole Village Project, where we surveyed the socioeconomics in 56 villages in northern Tanzania. So this goes from Mount Kilimanjaro across to the Serengeti and over to Lake Victoria. And so in doing these surveys, one of the things that was really striking to us was how the livelihoods you could divide the villages into one of two main types of livelihoods. Either the village was primarily relying on farming, so agriculture. So you have almost everybody there who is getting their living off of the land, they're farmers, or in other areas, they're almost all pastoralists. So it's pretty much an either or. And the reason that some are farmers, whereas some are pastoralists, has to do with rainfall. So if it rains enough, then people are farmers. There's enough rain coming down so they can grow crops reliably to support themselves and their families. But when it's drier, that's not a viable option. You can't do it. You don't have the rain, you don't have the crops. So instead, your livelihood depends on domestic animals like goats, sheep, and cows. So the cows can then convert the grass, and the goats convert the leaves, the branches, into meat that people can eat. So I'm going to dichotomize going forward between agricultural communities and pastoralist communities. So you have people in these areas with enough rainfall, can grow their crops, or it's so dry, all they can try to do is to raise livestock. So pastoralists versus farmers. So first, I want to be in the agricultural areas, and I want to discuss the most problematic issue involving lions, and that is when they become man-eaters. We did surveys in the southern part of Tanzania. I'll show it on a map in a minute, And we interviewed the victims' families and the survivors of nearly 1,000 lion attacks over a 15-year period. And this lady is telling us about how she was walking back to her own hut from her neighbors one evening. They're on the footpath between the two, and she has to pause for a minute to relieve herself by the side of the path. And her 5-year-old child is standing on the path. And then a lion comes up and grabs the child by the throat and starts to carry it off. The woman leaps up, chases after the lion. The lion drops it, but unfortunately, the lion had crushed the child's chest and it died. Now, these kinds of attacks don't happen up around the Serengeti. It'll be obvious in a minute why it's so rare up there. It's mostly in these agricultural areas. So here we have Tanzania. Here's the Indian Ocean over here. This is Zanzibar here. The capital of Tanzania is Dar es Salaam, and it's a huge city. It's like 10 million people there. And then just out of town to the south, you see 54 attacks over a 15-year period. This one had 95. This one had 185. That's about one attack per month for 15 years of lions attacking people. Now, we went and surveyed all these different areas, trying to figure out why it is there's so many attacks down here and hardly any in other parts of the country. And not surprisingly, we found that in these areas that had a lot of attacks, so attacks are going up this way, and the prey abundance is here. So these are areas that have fairly recently been converted from the natural habitat of East Africa to farmland. And so the normal prey of the lions, the wildebeest, the zebra, and the buffalo are gone. And so that's not much else for the lions to eat except people and one other species. So we were surprised to discover that there was another species that was really common, far more common in these man-eating areas than elsewhere, and that's a native species. It is native to this part of Africa, the bush pig. And the problem with the bush pig, it's a crop pest. And it's a crop pest that's active at night. And so I want you to be very aware that these are incredibly poor subsistence farmers. And they just have enough seeds to plant, get their crop, feed their family till the next season, and then plant the remaining seeds for the next year. So it's a very hand-to-mouth existence, one year after the next. And so when pigs represent such a large threat to their one and only crop, people, of course, want to protect their harvest. And so people construct these sorts of shelters, very simple shelters, just a meter or two off the ground. And so when the only prey that's available to the lions are these bush pigs, the lions follow the bush pigs into the fields, and then often they find people, and they're easy to catch because they're asleep. So we found that these attacks are far more common during the harvest season in that part of Tanzania, which is between March and late May. And this was the context. I mean, we asked people, and they kept telling us, yes, the pigs are here, and we have to sleep in the fields, and the lions follow the pigs. So we felt that the best way to try to address that problem was not by trying to control the lions. You'd never be able to do that very easily, but instead to try to make it so that people wouldn't have to sleep in their fields, so that people could stay at home inside four walls rather than in these shelters in their fields. And so this is just a series of control plots. So these are areas that were left only to be tended as they usually are, like this. So there were people there looking after it. But in some of them, another 17, we tried putting out like noisemakers. So there'd be like a trip wire around the farm plot. And if a pig walked into it, it might cause, pots and pans to clatter as it walked through. We also tried flashing lights, and those didn't do much of anything at all. But we also found that a simple little barrier around the field was really super effective. And this is partly because pigs, as the local people like to say, the pigs have short legs, so they can't jump. And so even a very short fence is enough. The pigs can't get across it. And so one of the things that came of this was that people saw our demonstration plots and they realized that they could make pretty effective little fences without having to pay anything. They could just gather sticks and vines and make their own fences. And that was enough to keep the pigs out. And so that was one of those things you really hope to see when working these kinds of areas, that you work with the local people, find a solution, and the people then adopt it, and that you don't need to be there anymore. So we had, as a result of all the research we did, I've just given you a very quick overview of this research. One of the most dangerous things for being attacked by lions is if you're out at night when the moon is below the horizon. So these really dark, if they do have to go out after dark and the moon is below the horizon, to go around in groups, lions prefer to attack a single person on his own. So going in a group is safer. And of course, if you got any kind of light source, then that will protect you as well. Uh, if you're going to have one of these dungus, one of these platforms, you should make it high enough that the lion can't get in to get you, and so on. And so the fence, etc. So these are the kinds of things that we left behind when we finished that project to try to protect people's crops and therefore allow them to stay somewhere safe so that they would not be risking being eaten by lions. Now, we then took the data that we got on those hundreds and hundreds of attacks, and I worked with an epidemiologist uh, back at the University of Minnesota, and we looked at the spatial temporal patterning of lion attacks that had occurred over that 15-year period. And the methodology was able to identify discrete outbreaks. So there's a whole bunch of attacks here that happen pretty much in rapid succession. And so that could be set aside as a particular single outbreak. Here's another one here, another one here, another one down here, another one there. And then I got data on tigers and leopards from India and Nepal. And we found that they also would have characteristic spatial temporal patterns. And then we could compare the three species. Oops. And so one of the things that emerged from this rather strikingly is that lions kill far more people when they become man-eaters than do either leopards or tigers, that their outbreaks last for about a year on average, whereas when leopards become man-eaters in India and tigers in India and Nepal, the outbreak only lasts for a few months. And then also really importantly, and maybe the most important from this, is that the radius over which this outbreak can occur is far bigger in lions. And so if there's been one lion attack somewhere, then if you're going to have an early warning system just to alert everybody in the vicinity, you need to be warning people all the way out about in a 50-kilometer radius around that first attack so people can be much more careful in following the kind of advice, not going out alone, et cetera, et cetera. And in tigers, you've also got to warn people, but it doesn't have to be over such a broad distance. So on that one, what we came away from that we felt were helpful for the populations of people who have to live with these dangerous animals was construction of these simple pig-proof fences so they could then go sleep at home rather than in their fields. And then these predictive models might help to alert people over the broad enough area so that the lions won't get a second chance once they become a man-eater. So the next thing I want to look at is livestock depredation. And this is a thing that's really the most important topic that I'm working on at the moment in my current research in East Africa. So in East Africa, we have a lot of the drier areas. Remember, the drier areas you can't farm, and instead you rely on livestock for your livelihood. So you're a pastoralist. And so these are areas where there's a lot of overlap between the cattle ranges and those of wild species, so the wildebeest, the zebra, etc. And there's still lions there. And so the Maasai people have traditionally kept cattle. The livestock have always been vulnerable to attacks by wild animals, by lions, hyenas, leopards, etc. And so they're armed. Unlike those subsistence farmers in southern Tanzania, where having to deal with lions is new and it happens at night, the Maasai take their livestock out during the day and they are protecting their livestock and they are well equipped and they have spears and they know how to use them. But the lions can often attack the livestock in a village. And when the lions are successful at killing livestock this way, people retaliate. They'll go out, they'll try to find where the lions have gone after they killed one of their cows, and they kill the lions in return. So this is clearly a major problem, both to the livelihoods of the Maasai and, of course, for the conservation of the lions in areas where they overlap with pastoralist people. So we did some research on this around the Serengeti, and we interviewed a number of households who had been herding their livestock in the middle of the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. I'll talk more about that particular area shortly. And what we found was these are pretty obvious results, that if you are a single herder and you're going out and you're trying to tend a herd of 150 animals, you can't look after them nearly as well as if you're just only with about 50. And so the risks of lions attacking your herd go up, the less effective you are. And so, like this group right here, there are 3 herders here. And so that's going to be a pretty good ratio. And so they're going to be pretty effective at being able to protect their livestock. So you need to have enough herders when you're out with your cattle to keep them safe. The other thing that popped out, and was just really blatantly obvious to us, was it's not always these grown men with spears. Sometimes the cattle go out with children as herders. And the lions definitely can tell the difference between a child and a warrior. And so the warriors, just their sheer presence is enough to inhibit the lions. But if it's a child, the lions are much bolder. And so this child right here he's now 9 or 10 or 11 years old. But when he was 7, he was out tending his family's herd with a stick, like this kid here. And a lion just came right up, picked him up, carried him a few yards, and threw him to the ground. And so this is the scars from having the lions biting him on the back. He survived. And his father was very proud of him that he was so brave. But we're like, wow. When we finished the study, we had conversations with the Maasai. We said, well, there's this big difference, and they said, yeah, we know that. And we said, but when you send your kids out, they're much more likely to get into trouble. And they said, yeah, we know that. And so why? And they said, well, we have to send our children out with the livestock during the day. Otherwise, they'd end up going to school. And we said, well, don't you want your kids to go to school? And they said, not necessarily, because if they go to school, then they're going to go to town and they won't be around to help us look after our herds in the future. And so one way we can ensure that we'll still have herders around 10, 20 years from now is by keeping them out of school and keeping them herding. So this is the kind of thing that you discover all the time when you're trying to work in these settings where there's such cultural differences and there are different priorities. And I mean, from the point of view of trying to maintain this, because I mean, remember, you need to have a lot of herders here to protect them. And if the kids all leave and go to town, then you're going to have a problem later on. So that's a challenge. That's why I call this challenges. Okay. So there's all of other work that has been done more recently than that study by others working around Africa. And they've done things to like try to reinforce the corrals. They call them bomas. And you can make lion-proof bomas. That's great, but they're super expensive. You can put lights and things around, but all all they do really is move the problem somewhere else. There's more and more people further and further away from the source population of lions, and the lions will just keep going further away if they need to get to the cattle. So rather than show you all that, I'll just summarize this by saying that protecting cattle is actually very expensive. It's not like making a little fence out of sticks and twine. You have to have strong material to keep lions out. And the effect of this is it mostly just shifts the problem to instead of the night when the cattle are in their corrals, it's during the day when they're out grazing. And it also moves them up further away from the protected areas. The lions will just go further away to get the cows. And the final thing that's a problem with trying to do too much of this sort just to conserve lions is that now people can decide, whoa, wait a minute, we used to avoid being so close to the national park because there was a risk of lions, but now we've got a way to be safe. And so some of the interviews that we've done around Kenya, people are thrilled with some of these cattle protection projects because now they can bring all their sheep and goats right up to the park boundary. So that's a real problem, as I want to show you now. So here we have the cows, right? It could also be sheep, it could also be goats. This is the dry area, and they need a lot of grass. Now I want to show you the wildebeest from the Serengeti. And the Serengeti is so famous because of its well-known migration of wildebeest over a huge area. And some of my colleagues there have put GPS collars on the wildebeest so they can see where they go throughout the year. And so the wildebeest have this migration where they come down here during the height of the rainy season. The grass is really green. This is very short grass that's much like this. Actually, this is the same as this. And when the rains dry up, the wildebeest leave, they go out. There's more rain over towards Lake Victoria and up north in Kenya. And so the wildebeest traditionally would show this clockwise movement out here and then up there and then back around the year. And so the Serengeti migration now, we know from having had these tracked for about 20 odd years with the wildebeest that they're not spending nearly as much time up here as they used to. That's changed over the last 30 plus years. And so you have this huge mowing machine. They need a lot of food to feed a million wildebeest, right? But they're in competition with those cows. And this is what the Mara looks like inside the National Reserve. And all of this, those are cattle tracks, because that's cattle being brought in by the Maasai inside the protected area. So this has become more and more of a problem over the last few decades. Here's a map of Masai Mara. Here's the Serengeti National Park. Here's a game reserve called Maswa. And all these little blue lines are taken from satellite images where you see these cattle trails coming into the park. And this whole area now has become grazing lands for people's livestock from outside. And right in here, and this is an area that I'm going to focus on now. So here you have, this was from, I think about 2010 or so, and this is more recently. And you can see that these things are getting further and further inside the park. So the Maasai are bringing their livestock further and further in. So now there's less reason for the wildebeest coming here because there's no grass. There's nothing for them to eat. So even though this, on a map looks great, you've got this huge area for all this wildlife, unique in the world. But in fact, people estimate there's only about 3/4 in the middle that is available solely for the wildlife. Now it's almost all of it's being dominated by livestock. So the consequence has been quite striking, especially here in the Mara. The wildlife abundance has declined by half on a 15-kilometer buffer in here. And so this relates back to the lions. I mean, this is a huge, huge change for the lions because now here you have them and they're going to have to start eating cows instead of wildebeest, even inside their own protected areas. So I had mentioned earlier that we have a particular area and it's within Maasai land. And just to give you a little bit of an overview, the Maasai are the dominant peoples who live from this part of Serengeti through up almost to Nairobi, out to Mount Kilimanjaro, and down here. So this is an area that has 2 million people, and it has 150,000 square kilometers. So that's how big this overall area is. And this is the Maasai came down from uh, northern Kenya, Sudan, about uh, 300 years ago, 250 years ago. So they've been there for a while, and they are the dominant population in this grassland area. They're the dominant pastoralist population through this area. Okay, now I mentioned Ngorongoro before, and I want to focus on this. It's quite a big area. It's 8,500 square kilometers. And where you had the Serengeti National Park, which follows a very similar model of land use like we have in our national parks in America, where it's exclusively for ecotourism. You're not supposed to chop down the trees or plant crops. That's supposed to be a no-go for any kind of human activity other than tourism. But Ngorongoro was the very first in the whole world to recognize the rights of the indigenous people here to be able to continue following their traditional lifestyle, which is pastoralism, raising livestock, as well as having tourist revenue coming in for visitors who visit the Ngorongoro crater, which is here, and then to see the migration out on these open grass plains during the wet season. The problem has been that when that was decided in 1959, the human population here was really small. It was only about 5,000 or 6,000 people. And what has happened in the 60 odd years since then is the population has grown exponentially to where now there's over 100,000 people in this area. The problem really arises because even in 1959 and 1960, this place is already filled with livestock. And so this term, tropical livestock unit, if you're ever asked at a cocktail party, what is a tropical livestock unit? It's a camel. But smaller animals than that are cows, about three-fourths of a tropical livestock unit, sheep and goats, they're like a quarter or whatever. But if you combine the body mass of sheep and goats with the cows together, and you add it up in terms of camel units or tropical livestock units, this has been constant. Oops. This has been constant over this whole period. So even though the human population has grown exponentially, the livelihood, the source of livelihood, their livestock has remained essentially unchanged. What this means is that per capita, there are very few tropical livestock units per person anymore. That's really dramatically dropped. Okay. And this is a really profound problem because according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, around the world, an individual needs 3 to 4 TLUs to be supported by this livelihood, by pastoralism. And the human population here essentially fell below that recommended minimum back in the late 1980s, in 1990. It has gotten further and further away from what's necessary to support all the people living in the NCA in their traditional lifestyle, should they truly be perfectly pastoralist, which was the goal of this original designation. And so what happened beginning in 2022, 2 years ago, the government authorities who managed the Ngorongoro Conservation Area decided we've got all these people, there's too many of them, and they certainly left it very late. I mean, there's now 100,000 people, and they said, okay, we want them to move 390 kilometers away from their traditional highlands and all these grasslands down to this. And this is a very different biome down here. It's coastal scrub, and that's where they were supposed to go. And so originally it was going to be voluntary, but people would go down and decide, nope, we can't raise cattle down here. And they came back. And they said, no, we're going to forcibly remove people. And they took steps to start evicting people from the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. last year, and then more moves were made this year. And of course, that created a furore because are you really going to move 100,000 people? You're going to move them way away from where they could possibly maintain their traditional lifestyle to an area that already has people in it. And so this has just been a huge crisis. And it's made a lot of social media all over the world because clearly this is not the right solution. But it doesn't change the fact, even though what the government's been trying to do has been very harsh, there have been beatings, there have been shootings. It's been very, very upsetting and unsettling. But on the other hand, it's still true. It's not possible for people in the NCA to survive on tropical livestock units. The area will not support that many livestock. So it's a really serious conundrum. Okay, and that brings me now to really even broader issues. We've got to think about this going forward because pastoralism as a lifestyle is very sensitive to climate change. It's already dry. All you can do is grow your livestock. They can turn what grass there is and other shrubs and vegetation into meat that you can eat. But climate change is really throwing a wrench into all of that. And so, one of the primary consequences that we've seen has been more frequent and longer droughts in East Africa. And so, there was a 3 year drought from 2020 to 2022 in the Horn of Africa. So, that's Somalia, Kenya, and then down into northern Tanzania, where 1.5 million livestock died of starvation because it's drought. And so 200,000 people ended up in refugee camps. And so climate modelers who've looked at the circumstances leading to these droughts attribute them to La Ninas. You know the El Nino La Nina cycle. Well, if you get a 3 year La Nina, which is what we had from 2020 to 2022, that's where you got an unbearably long drought. And those 3 year droughts are predicted to become 50% more frequent just in the next 20 to 30 years. So, as bad as this is going to become more and more common as we go forward with climate change. Now, when the weather shifts and we get to the other extreme, the El Nino years, is when we get really heavy rains. And so, we had severe rains in East Africa beginning in early November of last year, right the way through May of this year. There was flooding everywhere. And of course, those floods cause horrific erosion. And so you've got this very vulnerable landscape. Doesn't have that much vegetation with deep root systems there, and it can just get washed away. So that further reduces what's there. Another problem is that areas, as they become overgrazed, are more susceptible to be having the grasses replaced by inedible shrubs. And so this diagram sort of gives a simple version of how this works. That ordinarily you have grasslands that with a reasonable amount of light, moderate grazing, you might get some little scrub in there. And as long as the fire is not too intense, then you might maintain some of this cruddy stuff down here. But you need a fire to clear it out. The fire will take this out, and then you will preserve your grasslands because that's what the cattle and the goats and the sheep need is the large grasslands. So that's ordinarily as long as grazing is not too intense. But once you have overgrazing, and we're seeing more and more evidence of this with the current population pressures, is that the fire stops. Okay. So you're not getting the fuel for the wildfire because it's the grass that really shoots up the flames that then pass the fire on from one patch of woodland to the next. And so then you eventually get this. And there are many areas that I've seen throughout Eastern and Southern Africa that now, where it used to be open like this or even like this, now there's more and more in this. And this is not anything that the cows can eat. And so that land is now effectively lost to them. So high recruitment of unburned seedlings is the consequence because there's not the fuel for the fires to keep these things down and to eliminate them. Okay, so there's brush encroachment. But let's really get to the heart of the matter, which is overgrazing itself. So overgrazing causes the deterioration in the quality of the rangelands because left to their own, the cows are going to see 3 or 4 different species of plants and they'll say, oh, that one's really yummy, and they'll go eat that one. Everybody else wants to eat the most palatable grasses. And then those grasses are never able to put up seeds, they're not able to grow very high. And so they'll eventually die out. And then there are not just grasses that the cattle eat, but they also eat forbs, these smaller leafy things. And what we see is a very clear in these studies a remarkable drop in the biodiversity of the forbs. In some studies, as much as 50 and 55 species are now dropped down to only 10 or 20 in a hundred square meter area. So you're losing biodiversity, especially those that are the most tasty for the cattle. And then the grasses, they can withstand this a little bit better than the forbs. But then even the perennial grasses, since they can't maintain their height or their root systems very well because they're being overgrazed, they're being replaced by annuals that can grow really quickly in very shallow soil. They have very shallow roots, which is really not very good for anything. And then if it keeps going, then you just have bare earth. And there are any number of alien species, invasive species that quickly colonize these bare patches. And these are again unpalatable. They can create thickets, whereas before it was good grazing. Okay, so all of these things, when people think about this, as climate change continues and feed availability may likely further shrink, pastors either need to source external feed or significantly reduce livestock numbers to avoid overgrazing. How are they going to source external feed in extremely poor areas where there's really for miles and miles around, there's nothing? And then what can we do about reducing, or what can they do to reduce livestock numbers to try to reverse this? So I want to talk about my current research in Tanzania. I am involved on the Kenyan side with a lot of those livestock protection programs. But when I'm in Tanzania these days, I'm interested in this problem, which is trying to accelerate restoration of these grasslands. So there are a number of restoration projects that you can go throughout many areas of northern Tanzania, and it just looks devastated. Some of the areas that used to be perfectly nice looking pastures now look like the Badlands of South Dakota, just bare earth and a lot of erosion. And so there are a number of restoration projects being funded by the USAID, the Darwin Project from the UK, and the World Bank, etc. But what they're doing is mostly relying on whatever seed banks are still there. Because even in a place that looks barren and destroyed, if you leave it alone, there will be something that comes out of the soil from the seed banks. You've got to make sure it is a good idea, indeed, to remove the invasive species, and they might try reseeding. So there's a lot of these species that have disappeared. They're no longer in the seed bank. So if you do have a seed bank, it's just going to be the crummy stuff that's not very tasty. And they will try reseeding, but they usually just use a single grass species that's commercially available. And so these kinds of efforts are, pardon my language, but it's really just half-assed. They're not going to make real impact. And if you just leave it alone, remain relying on the seed bank and having birds drop seeds in their poop, it'll take a century before these areas are recovering. But you can accelerate that. So if you go in with a determined effort to intensively reseed these areas, and also if you capture rainwater to be able to keep the soil moist until everything is reestablished, you can do it much more quickly. And there are programs like that in the Western US now and in South Africa. So once you've done that, though, then you have to sustain the rangeland recovery. You've got to make sure that this isn't your project, it's the local community's project, that this is something that they recognize and value. And so this seems to be something, I'll show you what we're doing in a minute, to via creation of what we call the restoration economy. So these are jobs, sources of employment that young men and women can have to help facilitate this recovery. And so that these then not only have their employment, but the goals that they're aiming to by restoring these areas bring in economic returns, meaningful economic returns. And so then, of course, the grazing practices are going to have to change because what we've seen over the last 20 to 30 years has led to the overgrazing that's caused all of this deterioration. So I'm from the University of Minnesota, and the University of Minnesota's ecology department is most renowned for its work at a prairie site called Cedar Creek, just outside the Twin Cities to the north of our metropolitan area. And this is an area that since the 1980s, the ecologists there have set up these experimental plots. And each plot has a particular combination of plants that has had really important and relevant, highly relevant consequences. So if you have a restoration in these plots, it really depends on how many species you put into each plot. First off, we'll look at just the above ground plant biomass. And if you have a monoculture, depending on the year, you might have so much biomass, and it's pretty low. But if your plot now has two different species in it, you see a rather striking increase in biomass. Again, keeps going up to about 8 to 16. Okay. So more species better in terms of the above ground biomass. You also get a dramatic, an even more dramatic increase in the amount of carbon, the below ground carbon capture. And so more different species, more carbon captured in the soil. The more plant species you have, the more insects you've got. Of course, you've got different pollinators, different pests, or whatever. The more leads to more. And then most relevant, I think, well, they're all relevant, but another really relevant is that during some of these years where you see all these different patterns, the stability of the ecological performance is highest again with most species. Okay, monocultures, that you might see a lot of change in what's going on in that plot from one year to the next. But if you got 16 different species, you've got much better stability than with a monoculture. And so these are real world benefits. These aren't just hypothetical, esoteric, academic things. That's more fodder for the cattle. That's more carbon for carbon credits. And there are carbon credit programs now in East Africa. And carbon credits can generate a lot of revenue that could go to the local communities. And that money could actually exceed the money they get from raising their cattle, even. So that's a very real thing. Down the line, there's a lot of discussion going on about how to also pay local communities for maintaining biodiversity or restoring biodiversity. And so having all these different insect species plus all the different plant species would also make communities eligible for greater payments for biodiversity. And then with all these droughts and floods, to have that greater resilience in the face of climate change is going to be supremely important. So, how do you start? Where do you get going to do something like this? So, in February of last year, uh, my colleagues and I started a program to do this restoration in Maasai communities around Arusha, Tanzania. And the first thing we wanted to know was, what did the Maasai think? What are the plants that they truly value? So we held focus groups. We had first, we wanted to talk to the elders because they could remember what it was like before this overgrazing and this habitat deterioration got so severe. And it was fascinating because we've done a lot of focus groups on different topics in these rural areas for nearly 20 years now, but I've never seen a focus group like these, where you start asking people, and boy, do they know what their cows really like. And they really want you to, they want to tell you, oh yeah, the cows really like that. And it's like, well, okay, do you still have that around? No, don't see that one anymore. Okay, what's it called? Okay, What about this? Yeah, we still have that. Do the cows are like that? Yeah, but I mean, they're always listening to us, what's there, what the cows really like, and so on. And they're really into it. And so they have these animated conversations. We have our Tanzanian staff who were supervising these discussions, writing down long lists of all the different grasses, all the different forbs that were there, what was the cattle that they really like, which ones the Maasai have been using for medicine, which ones do they use for thatching, et cetera, et cetera. So we got these long lists from them. And then we have a Maasai botanist who works at the Tanzanian Plant Health and Pest Authority in Arusha, who's actually worked with the Kew Gardens in the UK and St. Louis Botanical here in the US. And he went out with them to make sure, because he speaks Maasai, but he has to be careful. We have to be careful to know what exact plant they're referring to, because two different villages might use the same word for two different species of plants. And so he was verifying which species they were, et cetera, et cetera. And so coming back, taking them into the herbarium, making sure what the scientific name is to make sure that we could then look for those plants elsewhere in different parts of the country, et cetera. So now coming back and getting the plants. So then once we've identified which species that people really want, we were able to hire people to collect those seeds in the field, bring them back, and we have these seed trays where they can then separate the actual seeds from the shells, from the chaff and everything. And then we collected large quantities. So this is all collected by the Maasai, separated, and then put into this. So each one of these buckets is of a particular different species from one particular village. And so that's just the beginning. The idea here is for the women to become entrepreneurs. Uh, there's been any number of efforts to have microfinance projects in some of these rural areas to try to improve the economic status, particularly of women. And so we talked to the villagers, and they identified certain women who would be the champions. They would be the ones who would lead by example, and they would be the ones to manage the native plant production. And then what we're doing also is to provide financial literacy trainings and then help them so that they can be the ones that then sell these plant materials. And also, if there's a good year of rain and the grass grows really high, then that can be baled, and then that can be sold as fodder to the zero graze livestock that live closer to town that are the dairy cattle for East Africa. So they can both use the fodder for their own livestock, or if they have plentiful livestock some years, they can sell it as hay. And then also, we are working with a carbon credit company called Soils for the Future, and we'll be helping to identify the individuals that Soils for the Future can work with so that they realize and appreciate the kind of money that can come in from the carbon credit, because that's going to depend on how much carbon they can put into the soil with these improved pastures. So we started this in last year. I
So,
had some money from the University
Professor
of Minnesota.
Packer, do you have a lot more? Because we want
This
to.
is about the last one.
Okay, all
I'm
right.
almost there. So this is
Okay,
coming to the final conclusion.
okay, sounds
Okay.
good.
Okay. And so we had funding from the United Nations Development Program, the Margaret Cargill Foundation. And so we had our first 43 seed champions going out. They employed another 350 people to help with the seed collection and planting, etc. Collected 1,000 kilos last year, planted a lot of it. And this year we collected 1,500 kilos. And so now the next thing we need to do is how can we rest these pastures? How can people then develop a way that doesn't just cause the overgrazing to come back? And so we're working with the grazing committees in these remote communities. Remember, they're very, very, very poor. And so this is the actual government office for one of the villages in which we're working. They do have rules for how to regulate the livestock grazing in each area. And one of the things that we know can help to make things better going forward is a simple strategy called tight bunch herding, where if the cows are forced to stay in a tight group, they can't choose the most palatable grass. They have to eat whatever they can find. And so then you're not eliminating inadvertently the best species. And then trying to reduce herd size is super important. One thing that we know has worked in some places is once that people have access to livestock insurance, they'll have fewer, healthier cows, and because they don't feel like they have to have so many in case some of them die. And one of the ways that they benefit and they want to have is the income they get from the milk. If you've got fewer cows, there's better milk production. And so dairy in itself seems like a really important way to go forward in all this because where women have an access, the women, it's a very patriarchal society, but the women have the milking rights and they have all the revenue that comes from dairy can go to them. And so the women get paid directly in the village where this is available. And so in those communities where they have direct access and they can sell the milk to the producers, they then decided to get rid of their sheep on their own. That was their own decision to keep their cows in milk because the sheep are the worst horrible animals for grazing out there because they destroy everything right down to the roots. So if they get rid of the sheep, that would be a great step forward. So this is my last slide. Sorry if I've gone too long. Is I'm just trying to show you a lot of different things that we've tried over the years, and we've seen that some strategies work, some haven't. So going forward, I expect to see the same thing. It'll be trial and error. Some will be great, some won't. And even those that look like they work good, work well, may only work for a while, and then that's just temporary. And always keep in the back of our minds that this is just the beginning. The human population growth is still going on. It's only going to get more intense, and that climate change isn't going to help anything. But, we hope that with the proper combination of indigenous knowledge, with meaningful engagement, and the profit motive, at least it's worth a try. So we're going to give it a try with these seeds. And that's it. Phew.
All right. Very good. Thank you so very much. First of
Yep.
all, we have about 12 minutes or so for questions, comments. I want to start off by just asking something kind of personal, actually. Are you from Minnesota?
No.
Where are you
I'm
from?
originally from Texas.
Texas?
Yeah.
So the question still applies. So how does a young man, young boy growing up in Texas become interested in all of this stuff? I understand your education background and all this stuff, but as a young boy, okay, elementary school, whatever, where did this passion all start?
I guess my bias from being a child was that uh, I grew up in my parents' household during the school year, but during the summers, my grandmother had a farm in a rather marginal farmland in West Texas.
Hmm.
And so I just loved being out there. And so I just was outdoors all summer. And
Okay.
I'd go fishing and I'd, hunt for arrowheads and all that sort of stuff. And I had a very close relationship with my uncle, and he was kind of a failed farmer, but he was still fun to be around. And I thought, well, I like being outdoors.
Mm.
And I just was always mindful. He used me as his field assistant. He was in college and he was taking an entomology class. He was
Oh,
supposed to show up with a bunch of bugs to show his professor. So I was the one who went out with the butterfly net to catch the bugs.
okay, okay.
and and I was the one that would go out and there's all this junk out there because ah, farmers everywhere just they don't throw anything away, so they have all their
That's
old
right.
gear out there, and you'd sort of poke around in there, and there'd be a skunk in a pipe, and there'd be black widow spiders, and it was just like, oh, that's pretty cool. So I guess that's my initial bias.
Okay, okay.
But I'll tell you then after that, because when I was just interested in the naturalistic behavior of these animals. And so I did my PhD and I was behavioral ecologist. I want to
Hmm.
know why do lions live in groups? Why do they have manes?
Hmm.
But with that distemper outbreak in 1995, I just was confronted by, whoa, wait a minute. Not only was there this impact that had happened on the lions, it was like, wait, there's a lot of interesting science you could do here.
Hmm.
And, so we measured all kinds of stuff and it was really fun. I mean, it was sad. It was one of those
Hmm.
things where you're both happy and sad at the same time.
Right, right, right.
And then working with the communities, just realizing, I just wanted to look at it from people's point of view.
Hmm.
I mean, what is it that, how do you cope? And when I started taking my kids over, uh, well, they actually spent their first few years of their life in Africa, but then they had to start going to school, and I started bringing them again. And my daughter, I'm actually staying with her right now. She's
Okay.
she works with Family Health International,
Hmm.
and I'll tell you how she got to Family Health International was because she was a snotty little too good to be in the field, missing her friends in Africa when she's 14 or 15. And I took her out to one of those Maasai villages, and we were finding out about how they were losing their livestock. And she just looked around and she saw other girls the same age as herself.
Hmm.
And she just realized, oh my God, what life is like through their eyes, and it altered her trajectory.
Hmm.
And so she ended up doing development studies when she went to college a few years later. And when she finished with that, she got a master's in public health. And now she works at Family Health International, which focuses on women's reproductive health and does a lot of projects in Zambia, Malawi, Rwanda. And
Wow.
so until she had kids herself, she was toing and froing over to Africa again.
Okay.
So that's one of those, it's just seeing there. And if you have any empathy and you recognize your own privilege, you,
Hmm.
and that, whoa, not everybody has that.
Hmm.
And so I felt that when I was seeing people, I mean, again, getting back to that distemper outbreak, starting to work in those villages, it wasn't just distemper that was a problem. I mean, yes, it was sad for the people to lose their dogs, but it was even worse for people to be bitten by rabid dogs.
Exactly.
And we encountered one family. This is the story that haunts me still,
Hmm.
is that there was a family and they had a cat and their daughter was bitten by the cat. And they said, oh, cats don't have rabies.
Hmm.
So they didn't do anything. And so then, however many weeks later, the child, the little girl got rabies and she attacked her father. He
Mm.
tried to bite him. I mean, it was just horrible. Rabies is just, it's
Wow.
the worst, right?
Wow.
And so seeing all of that, it's like, well, good. If we can use wildlife as an excuse to control rabies, wouldn't that be a nice situation, right?
Mhm.
And so it was one of those ways that when people saw us coming to do these vaccination efforts, the vaccination day, they all lined up.
Hmm.
They suddenly saw that, oh, well, this might not have happened if there hadn't been and it's sad that it took lions dying to get the international
Right.
attention.
Right.
But still, that was better than nothing, better than not having it at all.
So let me see if someone else has questions or comments. That you could unmute yourself and go ahead. I see.
I do actually.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Melody.
So actually, I'm on my work computer, which is Melody is actually, that's her computer. So my name is actually Heather DeMoss.
Okay.
I'm from West Virginia. Um, my degree is in psychology, although I've never worked in my field. I only have a bachelor's degree. I was unable to continue forward just for financial reasons. I wasn't able to continue my education, but my first love is psychology. So my question is, well, I loved your presentation, first of all.
Thank you.
My question is, how accepting were the indigenous East African people to you coming in and working and giving them advice? Were they open to that?
Well, when I mentioned the whole village project, we started that in 2006, and we always the goal of that was to go into these remote areas where there already had been aid projects of some sort. And so our stated mission in going in was to say, hey, we just want to know, how are things going with that project? And often the comments we get back was awful. They don't listen to us. Da, 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 da. And it doesn't make any difference. Da, 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 da. And that was actually good. That's why I wanted to do it, because my suspicion was, because after the canine distemper, I started getting much more mindful of what life was like for those communities. I thought, well, there's about $1 billion a year in foreign aid goes into Tanzania each year.
Hmm.
And wouldn't it be great if it worked?
Yep.
Aid has a terrible reputation for failing to work. And, I even sometimes I think of the aid industry as kind of the left-wing equivalent of the military industrial complex.
Hmm.
You've got the right wing selling guns and bombs and all that, but on the left wing, they're do-getters coming out to do all that. But it seldom works. It seldom works. And so our goal with that program is to find out which projects did work and then to get the feedback to those aid organizations so that they could then, put it in their toolkit to do all that. And so we ran up against another heartbreaking election in 2010 because we were actually, during the Obama administration, there was a lot of interest in the State Department for having a program like this to assist AID, the Agriculture Department, even the Labor Department has programs in Africa. But then all the funding was cut. So we weren't able to pursue that goal. But we learned enough from that. And then we did continue doing on a contract basis with the World Bank, with the Nature Conservancy to just still see how their projects were doing. And just over and over again, they might start out with a really good idea, and then they have a really extraordinarily stupid idea about how to implement it. So you have something that works great in a classroom where people show up and it's really, there's repeated follow up and oversight and everything. And then they decide to do that for 10,000 people. And you train the trainers, and the trainers are not properly trained and they're not properly paid. And it's not recognizing that those people actually have other things to do, like look after their cattle or raise their crops. And so it all fails like that. So, anyway, I'm trying to get at your answer, but just by saying, hearing all of that at the very beginning, when we started this project with the seeds, we knew the very first thing we had to do was to first connect with a few influential people of the community who are kind of their thought leaders, as it were, or people who are respected by the community,
Hmm.
and then call together what's called a baraza, these meetings where people discuss if they want to have that sort of thing. And of all the different aid projects that I've seen out there, almost nobody has come to them and said, "You guys you're the experts on livestock. If you were going to try to bring all this back, what would you say?" And they were desperate for seeds. They knew they needed seeds, and so they were thrilled when we showed up. And so we have an African staff who also really care. This is something that matters to them. And so, there's just a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of buy-in with it. And so in this case, we got it. And so one of the problems we've had with the Maasai is that planting seeds is basically what agriculturalists do. And so it's really not in anybody's background to go out and plant things. And so we've had with our champions, some say, "Oh, huh, so that's what seeds are for," and they put them in the ground. Oh, it works, and it's great. Others are saying, "Well, that's hard work because that's not the kind of work we usually do." I mean, they have other chores that they have to do. And so, in fact, we're working with a group right now who's trying to identify what those people had in common who decided to drop out as champions versus those who are now true champions and they're advocates for the overall program. And I don't know the results yet, but uh, there's differences in human temperament everywhere. Some people just get into things, and some people are especially inspired by this, that, or the other, and others just it doesn't resonate with them. They think it might work, but then they try it for a while and they get bored.
Mhm.
So right now, it just seems like personality differences that whether individuals accept it, but the communities, and they're all thrilled with the idea. And we have more and more communities who want to join us, and we don't have the funding to expand beyond just a few villages right now.
So I
Thank
don't
you.
know if you have a follow-up, but let me try to go over to Bridget. That would probably be the last question, because I'm getting close to class time as well. Bridget?
Yes, hi, good morning, and thank you. Is that Dr. Packer? This is Dr.
Uh,
Hines. I'm
yes.
an old UNDP staffer. Are you a UNDP staff member or
No, I'm not,
consultant?
but we got funding from UNDP and we met some of your colleagues. They were thrilled with this project too, actually. And we just put in a proposal to renew our UNDP funding. So
All
put in a good
right.
word for us, please.
Well, it's been years since I've been there, but that's what I did. I monitored so many of the projects, sub-Saharan Africa.
Uh-huh.
I You mentioned a number of things that interested me, and I'm sorry I joined late. I'm in the classroom currently. One of them is uh, what really ends up at the micro level. And I'd like to suggest that if the model for financing projects is not changed, it will always be that dilemma. There is always an overburden on the overhead costs, especially for expatriates. And that's why at UNDP we adopted Talk 10, which is transfer of knowledge to the nationals,
Yeah.
right? Talk
Yeah.
10, transfer of knowledge. And
Yeah.
so that principle of just uh, transferring the knowledge and not having the expatriates really spend all the project money
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
travel, tickets,
Absolutely.
hotel, what
Yeah.
have you.
Yeah.
So maybe that's something that we can think about. I was
Yeah.
especially touched by the previous question in
Hmm.
terms of psychology.
Hmm.
And it is very important, even as I sit in the US and hear such vitriol in terms of immigration and migrants. We have so many people going to Africa
Mhm.
to, as it were, interrupt what has been their centuries of lifestyle without any question. And the previous questioner, thank you so much, Madame, asked, were you welcome?
Hmm.
Because immigrants are not welcomed here in America, but we need to have the bread baskets go. We need folk from America to be welcomed in Africa. So I
Mhm.
hope that we consider the psychology of our movement in this world and understand this is a global village, and that, we could probably bring a lot of people to some of the acreages of farms that we have in America, where it's just land upon land with no one there. And rather than trying to uh, interrupt what has been successful farming in Africa. Welcome. Great UNDP project. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Right.
I just want to say to that our goal, absolutely. So I'm 74 and I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota. So I get my salary off of that. And I'm also on Social Security. So I'm fine.
Lovely. Thank
I'm,
you so much.
I'm working pro bono on this.
I
Okay.
understand. Thank you so
It's
much.
just because I do that. What we're currently trying to do as much as we can is to hand over. And one of the things that is really, really challenging, I don't know how much of Africa you've interacted in, but in my experiences, there's certain countries, and I'm thinking of Zimbabwe and Kenya, that have managed to, in their education system, produce quite a successful middle class of people with leadership qualities. And I'm afraid that's not what's happened in Tanzania. Tanzania has a very top-down, heavy-handed government. It's like what they're doing with Ngorongoro. And people, they're very, they're very reluctant to speak out and stick their necks out on anything.
Mhm.
And so we've actually been looking, and if you happen to know a good Tanzanian who might be interested in doing something with us on that, please, please let me know. We have a really good staff, and they're really good kind of middle managers. We had some people that we thought might well be able to step up to more an executive position. But then she decided to marry a Malawian, and now she's down there. And we have, so it's a challenge. It's just there's just so few people who get that kind of quality education, who are conceptual thinkers, I mean, they exist. I know them, but they're already tied up with so many other jobs because they're so scarce. Everybody wants to hire the same 5 or 10 people.
Mm.
So
I
anybody who knows
understand.
a good Tanzania would be great.
Absolutely. We have some folk I know. One, he graduated from the nursing program at Andrews University, and he supported, I think, 13 families while a student at Andrews. So
Mm.
there are Tanzanians that would love to connect. Your organization is?
Yeah, the pressures on the successful individuals in some of these countries is so huge.
Absolutely. Do
So
let me have your contact, and that would be great.
See
I
yes,
an
could get
opportunity like
that
that.
through
So
Dr. Murray.
we
yes,
totally agree
I'll
with
get
you.
her contact. I'll get you guys connected. And Heather, if you want to also, get connected, we could do that to anybody else, really. So
Absolutely.
It's
And
we
just-
I
have to
appreciate,
take
thank you
off.
so much for the invite. I really enjoyed this.
Yes, yes. So we have to take off. I got classes coming up here pretty quickly to teach, but we want to thank my co-host. She had to take off also for a class, Marlene Murray. We thank you, Professor Packer, for accepting our invitation and giving us a lot of information to digest.
Mhm.
And we want to also thank everyone in attendance, those who participated in asking questions and adding to the value of this episode. And so I wish you guys a wonderful weekend and invite you to continue coming on to Environmental Fridays. If it's Friday, it is Environmental Fridays, it is personal. Have a
Awesome.
great weekend.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.